Welcome to Train Signal. This is the Publishing Exchange lesson in the Forefront Threat Management Gateway 2010 training course. This lesson will be a little bit different as it's going to be very demo heavy and a little bit lighter on PowerPoint. And we're going to be focusing on the Outlook web access portion of the Exchange system. There's all kinds of stuff that you can publish with Exchange and Forefront Threat Management Gateway, including Outlook Web Access, Active Sync, and other things, such as Outlook Anywhere, or what used to be called RPC over HTTP. So in order to make sure that we scope this appropriately, we're going to start with a key set of assumptions. Now, one of the biggest challenges with Threat Management Gateway in a lab environment is the use of certificates. So I'm going to show you how you can generate and satisfy a certificate request in Exchange using an internal certificate authority, although we're not going to go through installing the certificate authority. I'll give you a hint though, it's not that hard. All you've got to do is go to the Server Manager on a Windows Server 2008 machine, which I've done on the domain controller for Global Mantics, and install the certification authority role. Next, we'll modify published directory properties. These are the properties of the directories for Exchange that we're going to publish out to the world. We have to make some modifications to those directories, or else we'll have some conflict between Threat Management Gateway and Exchange itself. Basically, we're going to move Exchange away from forms-based authentication, and we're going to force it to use basic authentication between Threat Management Gateway and Exchange. Now, that might sound insecure, but it's not, because remember, this is not the kind of traffic that's going to hit Exchange or Outlook Web Access from the outside. In this case, the traffic is going to hit the Forefront Threat Management Gateway server, just as it normally would, secure. Only Forefront Threat Management Gateway to Exchange will be using basic authentication. With all that out of the way, on the Threat Management Gateway server side, we're going to create a rule and a listener to publish Outlook Web App. And then we'll redirect HTTP requests to HTTPS, and we'll test everything as a part of this whole process as well. That's always a nice touch. Global Mantics requires some kind of external connectivity to the internal Exchange 2010 server. Employees do use mobile devices, web browsers, and laptops with the full Outlook 2010 client on a regular basis. With many of these employees working from outside the firewall, you've been tasked with creating publishing rules in Threat Management Gateway to support at least one of these use cases. In this case, by the end of this lesson, you will have learned how to publish Outlook Web Access via Threat Management Gateway, and you'll ensure that the user experience remains positive. Now, let's scope this appropriately so we can set some baseline assumptions. For the purposes of the Global Mantics deployment, all Exchange roles are on a single server. I'm running Exchange 2010 with Service Pack 1 on one server named EX1 for Global Mantics. As I mentioned before, I have installed a local certificate authority on the domain controller, DC1, that will be used to generate what's called a Subject Alternative Name Certificate as required by Exchange. Exchange 2007 and 2010 require these SAN certificates because of the multiple name nature of an Exchange beast. You have auto-discover, you have the name of the machine, you have webmail, you have mail, maybe SMTP. You can have all kinds of names associated with an Exchange implementation. In order to make it a little bit easier on the certificate side, Microsoft uses Subject Alternative Name Certificates, which are basically multi-name certificates on Exchange. Implementation of the certificate authority itself is beyond the scope of this course, but it is a simple role installation carried out from the server manager, and it didn't take me very long to do that. So our first order of business is to generate and satisfy a certificate request. Now, if you've already got an Exchange server in production, you probably already have a certificate, so you can skip this part. If, however, you're working in a lab environment, like we are here, then you're probably using the self-signed certificate that ships with Exchange 2007 or 2010. That self-signed certificate is not really suitable for much. So we want to have it use a real certificate at some point to make things a little bit easier. That's why I've installed the local certificate authority so that we can create and generate a certificate for the Exchange system so we can use the Exchange server in some demonstrations. The command you see on your screen is new-exchange certificate, and it defines all the names that will be used for this subject alternative name certificate that we're going to be creating. Now the next step says to copy the output from the screen. You'll see what that means in just a second. And then we're going to navigate to a web enrollment for local certification authority. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to save this output from the screen, which again you'll see in a second, onto a floppy disk, and then go over to the domain controller, and we're going to create a certificate based on the information we get from that new exchange certificate command. So I'm now going to go over to the exchange system for Global Mantics, and we're going to go ahead and take care of this particular piece of the puzzle. I'll admit up front that I'm cheating. I've copied all the commands I'm going to use into a notepad document so that I don't have any typos. So you can see the command there. I'm just going to paste that into PowerShell. Now to start PowerShell for Exchange, go to the Start menu, All Programs, Microsoft Exchange Server 2010, and then right-click PowerShell and choose Run as Administrator. It's going to basically do the same thing you saw up here. So I'll right-click and choose Paste, and you're going to see that that command will then get pasted to the command line. And then I'll hit the Enter key. And wonderful things will happen. We're going to basically get what looks like some gobbledygook on the screen. And this is the certificate request that we're going to send to the certificate authority to get our exchange certificate. So I'm going to copy this. I right-clicked and chose Mark. And I need to copy everything, including where it says Begin New Certificate Request and End New Certificate Request, being careful not to get extra space. And just press the Enter key to capture that. I'm going to run another Notepad instance. And I'm going to paste it into Notepad. One of the things I want to do is make sure that I've got a floppy disk available on this virtual machine. So I'm going to go out to the virtual machine settings and make sure that's the case. And you'll notice that there is a floppy disk that happens to be attached. And that's how we're going to transfer this document over to the domain controller so we can run it through the certificate authority for processing to create a new certificate. So I'll do File, Save As. I'm going to save this to the A drive. And we're going to call this E2K10. And we'll save. And then we'll close this out. So that basically copied the output from the screen, which is what I mentioned back in the PowerPoint. I'm now going to go over to the domain controller, and we're going to mount this floppy disk on the domain controller, and we're going to run it through the certificate enrollment process. So I have to detach the floppy disk because you can't use a floppy file on more than one virtual machine. And I'm going to attach that floppy disk to our domain controller. This is just like removing a floppy disk and inserting a floppy disk from a regular computer. And there's the domain controller. Now start a web browser. I'm going to browse to http:// we'll just do localhost because it's running right here. And you're going to see that we have some options. I want to request a certificate. I want to do an advanced certificate request, and I want to submit a certificate request by using a base64 encoded CMC or a PKCS number 10 file. So we'll click that link. Now it wants you to paste that gobbledygook we saw before into that space. So I need to get that gobbledygook. So we'll get that from the floppy disk. Here's that file. We're on the domain controller now. So copy it. And then paste it into this space. The certificate template is going to be for a web server. And that's all we need to do. So we'll click Submit. And that's all it had to do right there. We want the DER encoded certificate, so we'll download the certificate. And then we'll save that certificate to our floppy disk because we're going to move that back over to the Exchange server here in just a second. And I'm going to save it as cert new 2 because as you can see, I've been playing a little bit. Save. I'm going to go back to the Exchange server, but we're not going to continue quite yet because we're going to go back to the PowerPoint for a second. Now, we've already followed those instructions and created our certificate. So the next step is to go back to the Exchange server, and we want to go to the Exchange Management Console into Server Configuration. And we're going to complete the certificate request by following the steps that we see in a wizard that's going to come up. And I'll show you how to do that here in just a second. We're also going to assign all Exchange services except unified messaging to the new certificate. So basically every Exchange certificate or every Exchange service will use this certificate for its encryption. And if you get prompted to overwrite an existing certificate, that's okay. We also have to import this certificate to the personal store on the Threat Management Gateway server. This is how Threat Management Gateway is going to be able to intercept traffic that's destined for Exchange. So we're going to go do those two things right now. I've already taken the liberty of opening up the Exchange Management Console and browsing the server configuration. And you're going to see we have a certificate down here named E2K10, which is the name of the certificate request that we created a few minutes ago. So I'm going to right-click that certificate request and choose Complete Pending Request. It's going Complete Pending Request. It's going to ask me to find the certificate that we created on the certification authority. So I'll find that on the A drive. Cert new 2. And I'll click Complete. And you're going to see that everything was successful. So I'll click Finish. And then I'll right-click the certificate again and choose Assign Services. On the first page, simply click Next. But I'm going to give this everything except unified messaging because we're not using unified messaging. Click Next, and then click Assign. And it's going to ask if you want to overwrite the default SMTP certificate. Sure. And Finish. You'll notice that this is not a self-signed certificate. This is a good thing. Now we have to prepare this certificate so that we can use it in Threat Management Gateway as well. So I'm going to actually export this certificate by right-clicking it and choose Export Exchange Certificate. And I'm going to save it out to the Threat Management Gateway system. I already have a folder here called Exchange Cert. I'm going to call it EX1-2 as the second certificate from my testing. And we'll click Save. We also have to give it a password. This is going to save what's called a PFX file. And this is what we can use to import into the certificate store on Threat Management Gateway. And click the Export button. And you're going to see that that certificate was successfully exported. Now, we've got to go over to the Threat Management Gateway system and import the certificate into the personal store for the computer account. So we're going to do that right now. So on the Threat Management Gateway system, I'll go to the Start menu and just type MMC. This will start the Microsoft Management Console. Go to File, Add Remove Snap-in, Certificates, and then add the certificate snap-in to the console. We want to manage certificates for the computer account, so we'll click Next, and we want for the local computer. So we'll just keep that as a default and click Finish. And then OK. We've done that before, so that shouldn't be anything too new. Now, we've got to go to the personal store, and it's very much at the top of the screen. We've got the TMG certificate that we've been using for some other things, but we want to right-click certificates, choose All Tasks, and Import. This will start a wizard that will allow us to import that certificate into the personal store. So we'll click Next to get past that, and we'll browse. You'll notice that right now I have the wrong file type selected, so we'll change this to PFX. And we're going to use Exchange 1-2 because that's the most recent certificate we've been working with. Click the Next button. Type the password you assigned to the PFX file. And if you want to, you can mark the key as exportable. It's not going to affect what we're doing here either way. And click the Next button. And we want to place all the certificates in the personal store. This is how Threat Management Gateway will allow us to use this certificate later on. And you'll see this in action in a few minutes. You'll understand exactly why we're going through this process. So click Next and click Finish. And you'll see that the import was successful and our certificate actually does show up at the top of the screen. Now don't worry that it doesn't say EX1-2. That was just the name of the certificate file. The certificate is still assigned to the machine named EX1, and the file name has nothing to do with the machine name. Okay, we've got the certificate situation straightened out now, but we can't quite move ahead with creating a published rule yet. The reason is because we have to change some directory information so that it works with Threat Management Gateway. Basically, for the Outlook Web Access, the Exchange Control Panel, and the Web Services folders, we're going to change from form-based authentication to basic authentication. Threat Management Gateway also uses form-based authentication, and this default setting can result in conflicts between Threat Management Gateway and Exchange. You'll still be using forms-based authentication when you access Exchange from the outside. So, this brings up a couple of points. First of all, what we're doing here is only going to make Exchange Outlook Web Access work from the outside. If you try to access it from the inside, things will look a little bit funky, but all the internal users are using Outlook, so that shouldn't be a problem. To make these changes, you can do it from the GUI, as you can see on your screen. You can go make the changes for each of these directories using the Exchange Management Console, or you can use PowerShell. PowerShell is a good thing. And here's 3 commands that you can use in order to make this work happen. We're going to change the settings for the Web Services Virtual Directory, the Outlook Web App Virtual Directory, and the Exchange Control Panel Virtual Directory. Later on, if you decide you want to publish ActiveSync or Outlook Anywhere, you'll also need to modify the offline address book and ActiveSync virtual directories. Now, these might be cases why you'd want to have separate internal and external Outlook Web Access directories. For example, you want to have one that has basic authentication for publishing out to the internet, and another one that has regular forms-based authentication for use inside the firewall. We're not going to do that here. We're just going to move everything off to the internet and assume that internally everyone will use Outlook, and externally everyone will use Outlook Web App. Now, you remember before I had those commands that I had in the notepad over on the Exchange server. We're going to go back over there right now because that's the next step of this process. And here we've got the 3 commands that I'm interested in. So I'm just going to copy and paste these commands right into PowerShell. And that's all there is to it. If we go over to the Exchange Management Console now, and I go to the Client Access area, and I go to Outlook Web App, we're going to see that the defaults have changed. On the authentication page, we're using Windows Integrated and Basic Authentication. The default is to use Forms-Based Authentication. And the same is going to hold true for the Exchange Control Panel. I'll just show you since we're here. And authentication. All right, here's where we get to the meat and potatoes, the really good stuff. We're now going to create a rule and a listener so we can publish Outlook Web Access out to the world. This new rule for Global Man6 will publish Outlook Web Access using the IP address of 192.168.160.201. This IP address has already been added to the external adapter on the Threat Management Gateway server. From a naming perspective, the internal name for the Exchange service for Outlook Web App is ex1.globalman6.com, but users are going to access it from the external side using the name mail.globalman6.com. We have both of those names in the Exchange certificate, so both will work, although only one will work from the outside. That's the mail one. So we're going to use that Exchange certificate that we imported earlier, and we're going to test the new rule from an external machine. So without further ado, let's go over to the Threat Management Gateway system and work some magic. And now we're on the forefront Threat Management Gateway system, and I'm at the Firewall Policy area, and one of the Firewall Policy tasks is to publish Exchange Web Client Access. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to call this rule OWA, Outlook Web Access or Outlook Web App, depending on what you would like to call it these days. Microsoft changed it a little bit. So we'll click Next. And we're running Exchange Server 2010, so I'll choose that here. And we're going to publish Outlook Web Access. So we'll click Next. We're going to publish just a single website or load balancer. It's just a single site, so we'll click Next again. And we're going to use SSL to connect to the published web server or server farm. And we'll click Next once again. The internal site name is ex1.globalmantics.com. And we don't need to do anything else here, so we'll simply click Next. And the public name is mail.globalmantics.com. We have to create a new web listener because we don't have any right now. So we'll click New. And the web listener name will be OA-WL for web listener. Pretty nifty, eh? This does require SSL secured connections with the clients, so we'll click Next and choose the SSL secured option. And we're going to listen to incoming web requests on this network, the external network. So we'll then select IP addresses, and I mentioned before that we're going to use a specific IP address of 192.168.160.201. So I'll choose that IP address and click Add, and then click OK. And you're going to see now that we have a selected IP address on the external network. Next. And we're going to use a certificate. This is where we have to tell the listener which certificate it should be using when traffic comes in on this address. So we're going to choose Select Certificate, and we have a certificate called EX1. Isn't that great? That's the one we want to use. Now you can see why we had to import that certificate into the personal store. If we hadn't done that, the certificate would not show up here, and it would be unusable. So click Select. Click Next. Here's where we're going to kind of go back to HTML forms-based authentication, which is the default in Exchange for Outlook Web Access. Threat Management Gateway is going to handle the form side of things for you, and then it will communicate with Exchange using basic authentication. So we'll leave the defaults here. You can see there's lots of good stuff. And click Next. We're not going to be doing anything with single sign-on, so we'll disable that option and click Next, and then click the Finish button. That created the web listener for us, and we'll click Next again. And for authentication delegation, we want to use basic authentication. This is because that's what we set up on the Exchange server. So we'll click the Next button. And this is key here. We have to choose all authenticated users. If we try to choose all users, we will get an error because users have to be authenticated in order to be able to use Exchange. And click Next once again, and then we'll click the Finish button to finish this process. Now, a key part of this entire process is to click the Apply button and apply the changes to the Forefront Threat Management Gateway system. Now I'm going to pause the video for a second while the change propagates, and then we'll go over and we'll test this. We're now on the Windows 7 host we use to test things externally, and I've done an NSLookup for mail.globalmantics.com to show that I've added it to the external DNS that we use in this lab. There's the IP address 192.168.160.201, which is indeed the external IP address that we created earlier. And I'll then go to Internet Explorer, and we'll go to https://mail.globalmantics.com/OA, and you're going to wonder why we get a certificate error. Because we're not using a third-party purchased certificate, we do not map back to a trusted root. Remember, this is an external machine that's not part of the domain. Therefore, it does not see our certificates as trusted. That's okay for demonstration purposes. And I want to show you how we can prove this. So we'll click the Continue to this website, and then we'll look at the certificate error up here, and look at View Certificates. Look, the certificate is issued to ex1.globalmantics.com, and it's issued by our domain controller. So we know for a fact this is our certificate. This certificate cannot be verified up to a trusted certification authority. If we were to add this certificate to the trusted root store on the machine we're using, then we wouldn't be getting that error. But we're not going to do that for every visitor that visits our Outlook Web Access system. In reality, you would end up using a third-party purchased certificate. But I wanted to show you how you can use a certificate you generate in your lab, not really a self-signed certificate, but a generated certificate, to be able to test the capabilities that are found in Threat Management Gateway. Details and certification path is all the way up to ex1.globalmintics.com. But I want to show you something. If I were to just type mail.globalmantics.com, if I can type, I'd eventually get an error. And there's a good reason for that. Notice that there's just a little spinny ball over here that's just going crazy. Let's fix that. We're going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway system, and we're going to redirect all HTTP traffic destined for this address to HTTPS. In fact, that just happens to be the topic of our next slide. Users are not used to having to specify HTTPS at the beginning of every URL. Help them along by modifying that rule that we just created. So let's go do that. Now we're back at the Forefront Threat Management Gateway console, and you can see that our number one rule is named OA. I'm going to double click that rule, and I'm going to go to the Listener tab because this is where we're interested in making a modification. I'm going to click the Properties button, and I'm going to go to the Connections tab here. And I'm going to enable HTTP connections on port 80, and then redirect all traffic from HTTP to HTTPS. And then click OK. And OK, and apply. What that does is now all HTTP and all HTTPS-based traffic will be forced to HTTPS, and our users will be very happy because they won't have to remember which one is which. Let's go test it. There you go. So it now forced us over to https://mail.globalmantics.com with our certificate error, but you understand why we have that. And all is well with the world. This was a different kind of lesson because we really weaved in and out of our implementation at the same time we were running through the PowerPoint. But there were a lot of moving parts because we had to work with certificates, we had to work on Exchange, and we had to work on Threat Management Gateway. And that really tells you just how complex TMG can actually get. We started out with some assumptions so that we could limit the scope of what we're trying to accomplish in order to keep it attainable and rememberable. You learn how to generate and satisfy a certificate and rememberable. You learn how to generate and satisfy a certificate request so that when you play around in your own lab, you may have some opportunity to do that, then you will be able to understand how to create your own certificates. We then modified publish directory properties for Exchange so that Threat Management Gateway could more easily and without conflict communicate with Exchange while at the same time intercepting communications from the outside by virtue of the rule and listener that we created in Threat Management Gateway. We also redirected HTTP requests to HTTPS to make life a little bit easier for our users, and we tested all of the rules to make sure that they work well. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.